centered on reproductive physiology of corals and how that is affected by climate change. Additionally, some of her recent research is focused on preserving coral reef organisms using cryopreservation and developing the necessary tools and methods to cryopreserve marine life. I also asked Jess about her personal goals, and she said she has a list. So she's a very ambitious person. But one of them is she is going to be participating in a sailing race this weekend, where she will be sailing 24 hours nonstop around the island of Oahu. So good luck.
Welcome.
May the winds be with you. Welcome, Jess.
Do you want to sit there, or do you want to trade?
We can trade.
Okay.
Can I still talk to yours?
Yeah.
Good, because I don't think my mic actually works. Can I share my screen, please?
Yes.
So we want, let's do that. Wait, I know it's gonna look weird for a sec. And how does that look? Perfect. Okay, how do I move this? Ideally, I want to do something different, right?
Oh, you want to move this thing?
I want to extend rather than duplicate. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Then you don't have to see everything, not duplicate. Changes. Did that actually work?
Looks like it.
Okay. So I'll do that. Oh, we've got them running one way round. Maybe that was not the easy option.
Was the other one better?
Yeah. Display settings. I need to switch 1 and 2.
Okay.
This is one I want to. Actually, no. Let's just go back to extend. It's going to go way faster. Duplicate. It's going to be faster. Oh. I know there's another way to do this, but this I can just bring it down. I'm just gonna move that. Probably not. Whoa, back. Okay, that'll be good enough. Okay. So I thought I'd just kind of give you a bit of a geographic background of kind of where I've come, my little journey that brought me here in Hawaii. I kind of was born somewhere on the other side of the world in Switzerland, a country that has absolutely no borders with the ocean or no direct access to the ocean. And I just fell in love with the ocean. Something attracted me to the ocean from a very young age. And it's kind of when I got to university ages, I knew it was time to leave. So I kind of started traveling around the world. Does everything work?
Turn on your video.
Oh, you want my video?
Yeah.
Does that help? Okay, cool. I started traveling for, well, I left home basically to go and do my undergraduate degrees, and it's kind of kept me moving around the world. And it's kind of throughout my journey, I've had the chance to kind of live in a different range of countries, from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to the Arabian Gulf and to the Pacific Ocean. And it's basically brought me into some really interesting research. I got to do a lot of fascinating field work in some beautiful places around the world, working on a whole bunch of organisms. I've been invited to a whole bunch of research expeditions around the world also. And it's given me a really broad look at how the oceans are looking in different places around the world, and how they change in the last years, and kind of which direction they go into, and kind of the different threats that you can see in one region and maybe not in another one, and some of the advantages that some regions may have in terms of having a healthy coral reef for the future. So it's been absolutely fascinating. With that, I'm going to bring you, this is a video I filmed in the Red Sea during one of my trips, but basically coral reefs are really some of the oldest and most diverse ecosystems on the planet. They've been actually building these huge structures that you can even see from satellites, which is how big they're doing that. And they've been providing us human beings with a range of what we call ecosystem services. And it's basically services that they provide to humans. An example of that, they host about a quarter of the world's marine life that's in coral reefs. They provide food for millions of people around the world. They're a source of income for a lot of regions that have coral reef areas. They're an important barrier against storms and erosion. If you think of Hawaii, imagine a big storm coming in. If you have an outer barrier reef, that outer barrier reef is going to be the first line of defense against really heavy weather in terms of above and underwater. So they really do provide us with very useful services or ecosystem services. They're also a valuable source of medicine for research, and we still continue finding marine compounds in coral reefs that are actively used in pharmaceutical research. They've quantified, I wish I could move this thing. I don't know how to put it.
I think you can.
I can? Ah. Did you just drag it?
Yeah, I just dragged it. Just keep dragging it.
Okay. They've quantified these ecosystem services, and they estimate, and that's really a rough estimation, that every single year these coral reefs are providing us with $40 billion value of ecosystem services. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking of strategies for the future in terms of how much effort we want to put into kind of looking after our reefs or restoring our reefs, or doing some more drastic projects. We've got some very valuable resources that we depend on more than we actually realize. And before I get to that, wait. When you think of your coral reefs, you want to kind of think what is actually maintaining these huge structures that are making such a big, making big structures under the water. And it's if you actually zoom into the life of a coral, first thing you want to think about is a coral is an animal. And if it's an animal, that means it reproduces like, maybe not like you and I, but it reproduces. And this is basically how it looks like. So coral reproduction is a very special thing that happens maybe once or 2 days, maybe 3 days per year maximum. And you're looking at a window, each of these nights, it's going to be a window of about between 15 minutes and 1 hour, depending on the species, where they're going to be releasing eggs and sperm into the water. It's just those kind of very tight windows, and everything is happening in these nights. Here you're looking at a coral that's a hermaphrodite, so it's both male and female, and it's releasing these pink little bundles that are fully packed with eggs and sperm. And these bundles basically go up to the surface, and every single coral at that kind is doing exactly the same thing. So you're going to have loads, millions and millions of these bundles reaching the ocean surface. All these bundles open up, eggs and sperm is coming out. Fertilization happens at the surface of the ocean. And as the eggs slowly develop, they'll turn into a larvae. And within about 1 to 3 days, depending on the species, they'll be able to swim and start looking for a spot to settle. Once they've found a spot to settle, they will actually, so they'll look for a bare spot on the reef to settle on. and then that's their spot for their entire life. So they'll grow kind of starts at the beginning, they'll start very small. Some of these little corals there, they're probably about, I'm going to say 3 centimeters. You tell me how much that is.
Oh, that's like an inch and a half.
Yeah, so that's the size it kind of starts, and then it can become these gigantic colonies. Some corals will reach a size of, I mean, I've seen a coral, me with fins in, with my fins on a picture, I've seen corals that are at least 2 to 3 times my length. And so they can really continue building those absolutely massive structures. So you really need that replenishment of reproduction to actually keep a coral reef stable. It's normal for some natural mortality events to occur, but you have that balance because coral reproduction is happening and kind of replenishing the reef as you go. Unfortunately, today we estimate that about 3/4 of our reefs worldwide are at risk, and that's a combination of global and local stresses. And I'll start with the global one. As you all know, climate change is creating a lot of damage under the water. And we've got 2 things going on at the same time. We've got a very slow but constant warming of the water temperatures that is observed in most regions, especially coral reef regions in the world. And then you have temperature anomalies. The weather patterns have a little bit changed. In the hottest months of the year, you actually get in just much hotter temperatures than normal. Often it's paired with winds that are not cooling down the surface as they normally would. So there's quite a few issues that we're starting to see in the water, and they're creating a lot of damage to the corals, which are unfortunately very sensitive to temperature changes. And what that is actually doing to the oceans is creating coral bleaching. So coral bleaching is when your coral turns white, like on the photo. They're not dead at that moment, but they live alone without their symbionts, without their symbiotic partners. And the main thing is they're not getting they're not being fed during that time. They're actually not able to eat. So they're actually surviving on the energy reserves that they have. It's basically from one day to the next. That's it, you get no food, no water, and you just have to survive with that as long as you can. So that's what is happening to the corals during coral bleaching. And what is happening more exactly is every coral has a whole bunch of polyps. So it's a colony of polyps. And these polyps, which is that little thing here, if you look into it's got tentacles here. In the middle of the tentacle, you have a mouth that can actually theoretically eat food and release things. That's also where it releases its gametes. But these tiny little dots that you have in the tentacles and in the rest of the flesh, these are microscopic algae, and these algae will do photosynthesis. So the coral has that unique ability to pretty much do absolutely nothing all day and just get free food the whole time. So they basically just kind of like that sunbathing, and they're just getting that kind of, it's like getting a constant injection of food into the system, and they're really good at that. So it's really giving corals the unique ability to live in waters where there's absolutely no food in the water. That's why they're like crystal clear waters, because they don't need it. So this is the symbionts on the right side, the little algae symbionts, how they look like. And in exchange for feeding their host coral, they actually have a shelter, a habitat for them to live in, where they actually survive quite well. However, when the temperatures goes up, the link is actually broken. So sometimes it's the algae that actually die. Sometimes the coral actually just expels the algae, even if the algae are healthy. There's different ways that it happens, but the end result is the same, is that the corals lose their algal partners and then turn white. Here's an interesting picture on the top right, because you have, that was a few summers ago in Kaka'ako Bay. We had a hot summer, but one of the corals bleached, that was turned completely white, and the other one next to it, which is the same species, retained its color completely. So we're seeing that although they are very sensitive, we also seeing some variability in terms of how about how sensitive each one of them are. So we're finding that some of them seem to have some more natural resistance to increasing temperatures, and other ones are more sensitive. So that's an area where research is spending a lot of effort trying to find out, is there a gene that they can figure out what it is? Is there something that one of them is doing different than the other one, or is it really kind of ingrained in the DNA? Can you teach corals to kind of be more adapted to the corals or not? So there's a lot of interesting questions that come up with the fact that they don't all bleach. You have a lot of in between that happens. But that was a really, really typical example of, different individuals or different colonies, even within the same species, can react differently. If the corals survive bleaching, they'll get some new, if they survive, as long as the water temperatures are high, once the water temperatures go back to normal, they can get some new symbionts and actually replenish the energy reserves and start again. However, we know that it can still do some long-term effects on reproduction. We found that often when you have a bleaching event and they survive afterwards, they may actually not spawn, or they might not reproduce for 2 to 3 years at all afterwards. And this is just an example. In the group that I work with, we take some measurements of sperm motility. So it's basically like going to a fertility clinic, except that the patient is the coral instead. And we collect their sperm. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with the magazine. You just have to wait that one hour per year. You have to wait that 1 hour per year where it happens, collect your sample, and then we put everything on a slide under the microscope. And we've got some very fancy software that will analyze really the swimming patterns of the coral sperm. And generally, it's actually quite high. So for many years, we were looking between about 60 to 80% sperm motility. And this is data for 2 different species, the black bars and the gray bars. But what we saw that for both species, we had relatively high sperm motility. And then we had in 2014 and 2015, we had 2 very hot years. And after that, sperm motility dropped for several years. And we've got more data, which I don't have in my graph here, but we've got more data that's shown that it took me nearly 4 or 5 years for the sperm motility to go back to where it was. So we know that, okay, warming or temperature stress can actually do a lot on the really messes up the physiology of the corals. And even if they survive, the healing path is not finished. It can take several years before they get back to normal. So when you think about coral mortality, and there's a lot of big bleaching events that may kill a lot of coral, if we don't have reproduction to kind of jump in fairly fast after that, it's a very slow process for the recovery. And those are kind of years that are very sensitive for these corals, because they're not, health-wise, they're not yet at 100%. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. So that's for the coral reproductive side. We also know a few things, that when the temperatures are going up, we're starting to see a slowdown in the growth of the corals. Instead of growing maybe, let's say, for example, 1 centimeter per year, it might actually drop down by half of that. So it might take 2 years to grow that same amount of coral when it took 1 year before. So we're seeing in a lot of different ways, pathways, how it's affecting the coral. Well, I don't need to read that. I've written here, corals thrive in nutrient-free waters. So we were talking about that corals were the happiest in completely crystal-free waters because they don't need any food. And the other advantage that it gives to corals is that they don't have any competition. On a normal ocean location, corals have to compete against macroalgae. And macroalgae have a huge advantage, or just algae in general have a huge advantage, is that they grow really fast. So you have your coral, you have your algae here. After 1 day, the algae is up here, the coral's about here still. So they've got no chance. However, if there's absolutely no food in the water, the algae can't grow and the coral has advantage. And this is kind of a balance that maintains these coral reefs. So another big stressor that we have to coral reefs is a local stressor, which is land-based pollution. So this is an image from a semi-treated sewage output in Florida. And you can see that it's a big party for the fish because there's obviously a lot of nutrients coming out of there, but it's absolutely a killer for the corals. Because first of all, it's going to bring it could potentially bring a lot of bacteria in the water, but mostly it's bringing a lot of food in the water, which is allowing all the competitors of coral reefs to grow way faster than corals. And that's been actually one of the big things that you guys were doing with the Genki balls, is really kind of controlling, kind of bringing back to the ground, or kind of controlling all these things that were floating out of the channel before it actually got to the coral reef, so that you didn't have that negative impact on the reef. So yeah, crystal clear water is definitely what the corals need. And they found that in coastal areas, land-based pollution is really one of the biggest stressors. The good news is it can be very easily managed on a regional scales. Obviously, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of projects to kind of do so, but it's a lot easier at this stage to address than climate change. And it's the future of corals is obviously kind of facing big challenges with climate change, but if the only problem was climate change, it would be a lot easier to manage than if there was a lot of other things involved as well. So quick summary of where we are. We've got coral reefs in many regions of the world, but we're seeing a lot of decline everywhere. And this is just a decline in the past 15 years. East Asia, we've got 90% decline, Australia 24%, Caribbean 12%, Pacific, which is 25%. So we're losing our reefs. It's kind of going away slowly, but kind of with every stress event, we're actually losing a little bit more. And we want to remember these ecosystem services that they're providing us, and kind of remind us that there's a lot of planning to do, but there's a lot of directions that need to be followed to actually get where we want to be in terms of looking after reefs.
So with those reefs that have been lost, they're past bleaching to the state of being like dead, or could we bring them back?
Them themselves, they can't come back, but they could be recolonized by new corals on top that can grow on top. So when a coral dies, you have the flesh. Think of a human being glued to the ground. Okay. You kind of literally are glued, super glued to the ground. Imagine your skin, you had a bone that came out of your feet, and that was glued to the ground. When you die, your flesh is going to go away, but your bones stay there and you're still glued. And that you still create a habitat, you still create a structure on top of which a new baby coral or larvae could actually come and settle down and start a new one. So it's still contributing in building the reef. The trouble is if nothing comes back, or if it takes more time for things to come back, that things are going away. So it's kind of helping that balance a little bit. So before we get too doom and gloom, I've got the next slide is all the solutions. First thing is kind of one thing that we do a lot in terms of science is actually monitoring the status of coral reefs. So kind of just keeping an eye on things, collecting quantitative data, and just knowing when things are getting better, if they're stable or if they're getting worse. Decisions can't be made at the political level if we don't have data to show what is actually going on exactly. Then the second thing is addressing climate change, and that's going to be a huge challenge. Which let's not talk too much about. But no, it's going to be a huge one, but it's also going to be a slow one because there's so many players that need to be involved for this to happen. I definitely have hope it will happen. I just think it's probably going to go a lot slower than I wish it would. Third one, addressing local stresses, and that kind of is something that can be done immediately in a lot of places around the world. That is already being addressed. Restoration programs, we're starting to see some in more and more places around the world. So that's super interesting. Advances on the genetic level to get better adapted corals. It can be done by just breeding the more resistant ones. all the way to actually genetically engineering resistant corals, and we're not very good at that yet, so it might be a long path. And the last one, which I have a little bit of involvement with, is cryopreservation. So I'll start with monitoring. This is just an example. There's loads of ways you can monitor the reef. You can monitor how much coral you have on the reef, checking how much species you have, checking the diversity. This is me a few years ago in the Red Sea. So I was invited on that trip. There'd been a huge bleaching event, everything died. And if you look everywhere on that video, it's all dead coral. And you can still see that kind of structure that it used to have. So it's not very old, but everything is covered in algae. And I was invited to basically look at the recovery side. So it's pretty obvious in terms of live coral, I'm going to find something close to 0 or 0.1. But I was actually interested in looking for baby corals and looking how are they actually showing up yet, or is it too early? And it was a very interesting trip. So it was on a huge region that had been decimated by coral bleaching, especially in the shallow areas. But a lot of the reefs, I actually saw a lot of baby corals. So I was very confident when I left that trip that the cycle is still happening, and perhaps the regions that got hit by coral bleaching were getting larvae from other regions that did not have any bleaching issues. So as long as you have all that water movement, it can also bring larvae from healthy places to the more damaged places and kind of speed up the recovery process. So that was fun. In terms of coral restoration, there's a lot of development being done. It used to be just doing a lot of work under the water, and nowadays we do a lot more work on land-based nurseries, just because there's only so many hours one can dive and spend under the water. And if you have to be in the water every day, and when the weather's bad, then these kind of corals don't get looked after. So having them brought on land where you can really look after them is a really much better exercise in terms of scale and output. And that's something we do a lot of in Coconut Island, is developing some of the techniques for restoration that can be used elsewhere. And then I'm jumping to coral cryopreservation. So it was first developed in Hawaii in 2004 by a lady called Dr. Mary Hagedorn, and I am going to move that part because I feel like I need to acknowledge her. She's the only reason why I'm here in Hawaii. I wanted to work with her. She had a lot of knowledge and was doing some really cutting edge science, and I basically flew from quite a while away from the other side of the world to come over here. So she completely pioneered a lot of the techniques that are now being used for coral cryopreservation. And the idea is kind of, we do assisted breeding for pandas, we do assisted breeding for all these endangered land animals. Why can't we do it for corals when they are having issues? So she uses some fun techniques, but we've got a lot of projects going on at the moment.
Is that center picture like stuff being released from that type of coral?
So that center picture, this is actually a female coral. Remove that. This is a female mushroom coral releasing a lot of eggs. So that butterfly fish, that's in one of my tanks. That butterfly fish just got extremely excited because it's kind of, yay, free food. And he basically followed every single coral spawning in my tank that day. But yeah, that's a kind of outflow of eggs. So far, things that we are able to freeze using cryopreservation. So cryopreservation is just kind of basically bringing animal cells or any cells down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, which in Celsius is -196. You'll burn if you touch it. I have no idea how much that is in Fahrenheit, but we're going to say cold. But things we are able to cryopreserve nowadays is coral sperm. We can freeze coral larvae, we can freeze the algal symbionts, and we can freeze tiny little coral fragments. So I want -196.
I think they converge.
So yes, isn't it the same thing?
They converge.
Is it?
There's a certain degree of negativity
Oh.
and they converge and they're actually the same.
-40.
Yeah.
-40 Celsius,
Yeah.
-40 Fahrenheit.
So they're the same.
Yeah.
So what minus 196 Celsius is actually minus 320 Fahrenheit, according to Google.
Okay.
I don't know.
Either way,
There's-
really
Google's
cold.
probably
Oh.
right.
Oh, cold.
Okay.
Oh.
Interesting. That's very cold.
We actually have, that has been started by my boss, Mary. We've actually started some sperm banks for corals in a whole bunch of regions around the world. So we now have 10 species from the Caribbean. We've got 4 species or sperm from 4 species from Hawaii, 4 species from French Polynesia, and and 6 species from the Gulf of Mexico. The first 4 are all conserved in Fort Collins in Colorado in the USDA's germplasm bioreserves. So super, super safe buildings. It's basically made to resist a lot of bad weather. It's completely off the grid on the electricity side. It's kind of the most safest place where we could have our sperm bank. And yes, they've given us a little corner for our coral sperm from around the Pacific and Caribbean region. We also have a bunch of species cryopreserved, 20 sperm from 26 species in the Great Barrier Reef. And the latest one has been my contribution, which is in the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. We've got sperm from 3 species. So I was lucky a few months ago, I was invited there to start the first coral sperm bank of the whole Middle Eastern region. So we kind of got it started over there, and hopefully in the years to come, there'll be a lot more.
So are those actual coral sperms on the bottom left corner?
No, that is not. No, that is just a generic
Humans.
Google image.
Just
But you'd be
curious.
surprised they don't look that different. Actually, it's sperm from so many animals look so similar to each other. No, it's quite fascinating.
So is there a way to monitor when they're going to spawn, or you just kind of wait?
So if you look the top left coral, so that is a mushroom, a male mushroom coral.
Yeah.
Or it's he's basically releasing sperm on that one.
Yeah.
So for that species in Hawaii, because it's different for every species, it's different for every region. That species in Hawaii will spawn in the summer, close to the full moon, and it will spawn around between 5:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. So, and we're not, sometimes it starts on the day of the full moon, generally 1 or 2 days after the full moon, sometimes up to 3. So we usually start watching the day of, drink some cheese and wine just in case.
Do you just like
nothing
sit there and
happens,
look at them?
and drink cheese?
Like
drink-
there's no
yeah.
like camera that watches it.
No,
Okay.
you have to literally sit there, because as soon as they start going, it goes very fast. So once they start going, this guy, he's going to release maybe 4 or 5 good puffs, and it's kind of like imagine an exhale smoke from a cigarette, or even let's say a cigar. It's a lot more smoke, and you need to be there with your pipette ready to kind of take it and put it in your tube. Yeah.
Hopefully you didn't have too much wine.
Well, if they do not, yes. Well, we've had times where we thought they were going to do nothing. We had plenty to drink, and then everything was going. You get sobered up really fast. This is some of the work that I've been doing. It's developing the techniques for algal symbiont cryopreservation. It's been mostly a lot of failure, but in the end, it's actually started working. So it's, unfortunately, we don't have only one type of algae that the corals like. There's probably as many algal symbiont types that exist in the world as coral types, and every coral has its favorite algal symbiont, and some of them will not take the other ones. So we're actually starting to think about building a frozen reserve of all these different algal symbionts for different regions, for different species, just to have some backup material, because we think about coral bleaching, where we're losing the symbionts every time there's a bleaching event. We assume that they're to kind of come back and kind of pair again with the coral, but if they don't, we're in a serious trouble. So it's kind of finding a way to kind of get them separated, but we've got some good things going on at the moment.
Where do they come from?
the algal symbionts. They will multiply, they will just live in the corals as a host. Around spawning time, the corals tend to release a little bit in the water, which is basically they'll make them available for larvae to find them and kind of take them up, or for juvenile corals that have already settled down to kind of, so they can get their own. But there's a lot of unknowns of exactly how long can they survive outside of the coral. Some of them seem to be able to do really well in just living in the water, but some of them we never find them in the water column. If we take water samples, they're just not there. Some of them could be in the sediments, in the sand, but if we don't know, it's hard to kind of just assume that they'll always be there. So that's kind of been one of my big projects, and probably some that I'm going to be taking with me for my next research endeavors. I think. Okay, and that's my take on messages. So basically, we've got corals are really heavily threatened by climate change. To save corals, climate change absolutely needs to be addressed. And I think that's really somewhere we have to push in that direction. Even if it moves slowly, it's worth moving there, as long as we're in that direction. And until then, we just need to kind of keep an eye on the health of the reefs globally, but also actively preserve, using a whole bunch of different techniques, everything we can, just preserve the natural underwater heritage that we've been given over there. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great.